Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast, and if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Candice, for coming on to the podcast and to speak about your book, Congotay, A Global History of Caribbean Foods. And I'll let you just to introduce yourself to the listeners.
Well, my name is Candice Goucher. I'm a historian by training, also an archaeologist. I started as an Africanist working in West and Central Africa, and only in my 30s did I have an opportunity to travel to the Caribbean.
Oh, wow. Amazing. Great. Thank you. So, and as I said before we had started, I really enjoyed your book, and I liked how, everything flowed with that. And I just wanted to know what motivated you to explore the history of the Caribbean cuisine in such a detailed manner.
Well, it's a bit of a long story, but it really begins in Africa. Because I came late to the Caribbean with a lot of Africa experience, I found myself constantly seeing colors and foods and people that reminded me of West and Central Africa. And specifically, I was struck by these similarities. The words for certain foods were identical on both sides of the Atlantic. So I started, recording my observations, and I began to take notes and eat my way through the Caribbean. And discovered as I began to research the topic that almost no one had written about the history of food. And those who had really contained their thoughts and their research in cookbooks. So it was very interesting that food studies was very separate from, the work of historians. So that started me down a path that I became determined to discover the connections between Africa and the Caribbean.
Wonderful. And it sounds like a great path to go down as well, to be able to taste all those different foods. And, your book title, Congotay, has different meanings across the Caribbean. Would you be able to explain the meaning as to why you use that in the title of your book and how it reflects the themes in the history of your book?
Yeah, that's a really powerful observation. I think Congotay does have a number of meanings, and historians, of course, have identified the earliest movement of peoples and their cultures from areas of the Congo into the Caribbean. Beginning in the 16th century, you have key Congo words from being spoken on both sides of the Atlantic. But J.D. Elder, Jacob Elder, is a anthropologist trained as a sociologist as well. And he was born on the island of Tobago in 1914, I think. And he began to record many of the children's songs that he had learned as a child, and other aspects of local culture, music and storytelling, games, children's games. And one of those games was called Congotay, and he writes about that game, which was kind of a mother hen and baby chicks chase and capture game. So there's a reference to that, And Congotay also is a word that's used for porridge that's made out of cassava. Cassava is what old timers would call olding food. It's a food that really strengthens you and holds back the hunger for much of the day. And of course, cassava is a food that is local. It's indigenous to the Americas. Likely, it was domesticated first in Brazil, in the rainforest of Brazil, some 10,000 years ago. So it's a very important crop because it's also drought tolerant. But it has another quality, and some varieties of cassava contain a particularly large amount of poisonous toxins. And so they need to be boiled off, and it sometimes then becomes something known as kazarup, which is a syrupy food used for stewing meats of various kinds. Pepper pot, for example, is from kazarup. And then Congotay is also a reference to a proverb in some places, meaning one day, Congotay. In other words, one day, the justice will prevail. One day we will be free. So it's a very powerful way to express, I think, a very nuanced way of looking at the world, an acceptance of what is now. Reality won't always be that way. Change is inevitable. And then finally, Congotay also refers to foods that are particular to religious observances, ceremonies. So as a gesture to African ancestors, Congotay is ritual food. So the title, essentially, Congotay, reflects all of these different layers of complexity and multiple meanings that are found in Caribbean history. And in a sense, there you have the themes of the book as well, that how food expressed and maintained an African identity, African values and cultural elements, even while borrowing from other peoples and places. It is the story of the African diaspora, adaptation, resistance, survival, that is passed on from one generation to the next, from mothers to children, as the children's game suggests. It's one generation to the next at the dinner table, and in religious rituals that have been and continue to be empowering to individuals and communities across the region. So I think it reflects that kind of bewildering complexity that is really what the Caribbean is all about.
Yes, definitely very multifaceted for sure. And so with the Caribbean cuisine, it's known for its vibrant flavors and diverse cultural influences. How does your book trace these origins and evolutions of these influences that have shaped the Caribbean for what it is today?
Well, the book, I think, is organized chronologically, and so it starts in the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. I begin with maritime foods in the first chapter that were common to everyone who traveled to the Caribbean, whether they were enslavers or enslaved. They had in common a particular diet that was a maritime diet, and that's salted everything, salted cod, salt pork, sea biscuits that were twice baked, very hard wheat flour biscuits. So the experience of being enslaved, the experience of being an enslaver, of living inside of a slave society, comes next, where Africans were commodities shipped into the region, but where they were in large numbers able to shape the cuisine
Mm-hmm.
of the region. So I moved through major aspects of Caribbean history through the themes of those foods. So the maritime, the African provisions, the commonalities of sugar production and sugar islands and how important sugar was. We can learn a lot about, I think, creolization, adaptation, transformation in history. This essentially is the story of globalization. And the Caribbean was the first place where globalization happened.
Definitely. And, you know, with Caribbean food, as you mentioned, you know, it's characterized by the infusion of African, indigenous, European, and Asian culinary traditions. How does the book, you know, delve further into this fusion and the resulting of the unique flavors that are characterized just by the Caribbean food?
Well, one thing I should mention is that the book includes a lot of recipes.
Yes.
And so it really centers on the food, on recipes for the food, and it uses those specific recipes to delve more deeply into the experience of cultures and histories becoming, you know, intermingled and blended together. An example of this is pepper pot.
Yes.
So it starts, you know, as an example of mixing cultures, it starts with Indo-Guyanese and African Guyanese peoples taking indigenous foods, cassava, iguana. The iguana is interestingly adapted taken over by Catholics who come in as immigrants. It's as an aquatic creature. It gets defined by the Vatican as fish. We know that, of course, iguana is not a fish, but it was viewed as being, you know, jumping into the water and jumping out of the water and so on. So it was permissible on days of fasting. Korean roti, similarly, one needs to think about the history of both, as one historian put it, conquerors and the conquered. In that story, the curry becomes the Englishman's imperialist beloved flavor, and it connects the experience of immigrants in South Asia with the Caribbean, which translates to the movement of peoples, not just South Asians, not just Africans, but also British officers and immigrants. It ends up being synonymous with African and East Indian tastes in parts of the Caribbean. So pepper pot begins as this indigenous food, moves to African tables, then it ends up as street food in Philadelphia. So you can watch both the development and evolution of specific dishes and recipes, and their spread, their diffusion over time and space.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, as you touched upon that, you know, with colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, you know, it played a very significant part in shaping the Caribbean. How does your book, you know, address the impact of these historical events on the culinary practices of the food culture in the Caribbean?
Yeah, well, I think food, this is what makes food history so important, is that it is a way that individuals experience the larger global forces that are present in our lives. So foods can cross national boundaries, social boundaries, gender boundaries, cultural ones. And I think foods have the potential to both unite and divide. That is, express those commonalities that everyone agrees on and becomes the basis for unique cultural creolization, if you will. But the patterns of interaction are unique to every island, despite the fact that the ingredients may be common, they find different expressions. So I think it's a way of navigating this complexity of what we call history, big global forces, and the most intimate thing you can imagine, eating and consuming food, putting food into your mouth, into your body. So it happens, it's history on an individual basis.
And going with that theme, because these culinary traditions often play a role in preserving cultural identity. And so again, the book, how does it delve into that relationship between Caribbean food and the preservation of Caribbean cultural heritage?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of written evidence, right, for food history, and more recently, historians have initiated a practice they like to call reading against the grain. So looking at this historical evidence from a perspective that might be critical, that might look for what is missing, what is being obscured, what is being distorted or stereotyped. So there's a lot of written evidence for food. For example, the maritime laws that dictated what would be fed to voyagers on ships in the Atlantic Ocean. And those diets differed whether you were an African being transported or an East Indian coming from the Indian Ocean area. The laws themselves created a kind of singularity of identity. You were African, you were East Indian, where that commonality really didn't exist. So if we look more closely, the diets as they were prescribed don't pan out. First of all, enslavers were being told by the governments what they should provide in the way of provisions to slave communities. But if we look more closely, we can see that those diets were insufficient. And so this meant that the enslaved, the indentured, were forced to create their own foodways. And so reading against the grain tells you a different story. Archaeology tells you a different story. People were not cooking inside of their own houses. They were following the African practice of cooking outside in courtyard areas, in shared spaces. So we see that, in fact, Africans were creating their own foodways. They were hunting and gathering and foraging and growing their own food. And they were so very successful that in times of crisis, hurricanes or famines, they were able to save their own lives and the lives of their enslavers. So we see the persistence, this amazing persistence of African values and African foodways, in spite of the experiences that they were living through.
Definitely. And, in the process of you researching and writing this book, what were some of the more surprising or enlightening discoveries you made about the history and evolution of Caribbean foods?
Well, it's interesting. I think we tend to think of food as having two characteristics, the taste and smell. But in fact, what became so obvious is that food is so much more complex in many cultures. But in particular, in the Caribbean, foods have textures. They have names that can be proverbs or complex references. They have colors. And so you have preserved in foods essentially secrets that women hold, that are acquired gradually by men and women, by children, eventually in the course of their lifetime as they become culinary experts. They learn the language of food. So certain foods that symbolism is very complex. in African religions that have been carried across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. You have deities who had their own preferences. So rituals that where certain deities liked sugar or liked certain colors of food. And the chefs who are attached to those religions, and there were specialists who cooked for the deities, the ways of cutting up an okra, the use of salt, or the, avoidance of salt, the viscous characteristic of certain foods, the color of a dish, all of those speak to people. And I think what becomes so interesting and obvious, and if you think long enough about it, food itself has great agency. Food can make things happen. I think food becomes a character in history if you taste it and listen to it and see it and pay attention to it.
No, definitely. And for that to carry over from, that time frame period, the backdrop, it just shows, as you said, the power of food in terms of that being carried from one generation to the next. And, for today's day, even to say what's being eaten in the Caribbean is then eaten very similarly onto the continent of Africa as well, which is, it definitely makes you think outside of the box type of thing, right? So, because the other thing is, in your book, you made the point of telling the whole story from original people and defining Creoles. Why was this important to stress and to illustrate this link in the story of food?
Well, I think we know that there were systemic transfers of food and language and culture. We maybe take it for granted.
Yeah.
And I think that's partly because food was a domain of women, and women's contributions have been overlooked. But I think food is just as important, and what happened at the table in terms of cultural transfer was just as important as what happened inside of economies or governments and other places where women traditionally were excluded. So you have, I think, specifically in the Caribbean, cuisines becoming the original language of encounters, the original language of ideas about sustainability and global identity. So many lessons to be learned from the story of food. And I think food history allows us to taste the past, literally, in all of its complexities. We kind of take for granted, right, that globalization is everywhere around us, but in fact, it's in the Caribbean that you have the initial experience of that process. And that process was sometimes a process of creolization, of creating something new. So the term really began as a way to describe someone who was born in the Caribbean, not necessarily white or Black or of African descent or not, but someone born there locally. And so there was a recognition, I think, that the Caribbean created opportunities for people to become something new and different, and something that was created out of this unique encounter between Indigenous, African, Asian, European cultures. So it's historic.
Yeah, definitely. And still continuing with this theme of defining the Creole people, specifically individuals of African descent. What were the systemic transfers of food and connection to their language, and traditions?
Mm-hmm. I think the ability to name something is very empowering. And so we see words like okra. That's comes from an African language. So I think naming an ingredient, being able to bring seeds and grow locally plants that were important in your original homeland, that was also very important. That's a gift from the ancestors. That's a recognition of this continuity of past into the present. So I think, we have here the survival of African values, of African pride and cultures against all odds. And there's a lesson in there. I think, historians have spent way too much time focused on the enslavers, and not enough time on the day-to-day experiences that everyone, was partaking in. And it's that day-to-day experience that enabled survival, that enabled resistance of African peoples.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, definitely what you said in terms of the, continuing of that connection with food and with language, and of the, I guess you can say, genealogy of people still being, surviving today. And, I guess, what impact do you hope that your book will have in promoting a deeper understanding and appreciation of Caribbean food and its historical and cultural significance?
Well, I mean, we hope that people will be interested in history. That's not always the case.
Yeah.
Lots of reasons why we might turn our backs on history. But I think as we become more and more globalized in our lives, we maybe take for granted the fact that when I look at my plate, my dinner plate, or you look at your dinner plate, that we have the world on our plate. We have foods from every part of the globe, foods that have originated in one place and been taken to another. And I think if nothing else, that an appreciation for the extent to which that globalized experience begins in the Caribbean. That's our first global community. We have a lot of lessons to learn from that experience of survival and resistance and adaptation. And I think that both the commonality of the foods that we eat, and also the distinctiveness, the distinct stories that those foods can tell. Hopefully that's what people will get out of my book.
Perfect. Thank you. And then, as we come to a close with this, again, probably now it's the message that you like to have readers take away from the book, and how you envision your book, contributing to the ongoing appreciation of Caribbean cultural heritage.
I think one of the interesting things that I'm beginning to see is how Caribbean tastes have traveled so far. I live in Portland, Oregon, and we have an amazing Haitian restaurant. Gregory Gourdet's restaurant Con serves up the most amazing Haitian food. So we can look at that story of Haiti, for example, as being a story of hunger and imperialism and oppression and violence, or we can look at it as being a story of resistance and persistence. Keeping those flavors intact, is a globalization miracle when you think about the past that particular island has experienced. So I hope that food can remain an inspiration to people to learn about the past and to encounter the lessons of what that past might tell us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And again, I appreciate your time. So we'll end here. But again, thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.